Welcome to Unit 8, Lesson 2. Today we're going to discuss why and how do we breathe. And this video is optional unless you've missed class. So by the end of this video we should be able to explain why we breathe, identify and explain 3 types of respiration and where they occur, explain how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, and then there's a series of reactions we need to understand, and we also need to be able to understand how equilibrium reactions work and how this influences gas exchange in our body. And finally, we need to know how the various reactions are progressing in internal versus external respiration. So let's begin with why do we breathe? Obvious answer, to stay alive. But to be particular, to maintain cellular respiration. Which we're going to just abbreviate here on out as CR. And thus a functioning body. So in particular, to maintain cellular respiration, we need to acquire blank for CR. What gas do we need to do cellular respiration? If you said O2, perfect. And we need to excrete blank, which is a byproduct of CR. If you said CO2, also excellent. Okay. Now, just as a little reminder, recall that CR is, as an equation, we need 6 oxygen molecules plus 1 glucose. Formula, please. It's C6H12O6. Excellent. Being converted to 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus ATP. And just as a reminder, what is ATP again? If you said adenosine triphosphate, excellent. I was actually going for, though, what is its purpose in this cell? And if you, whoops, sorry guys. If you said it is the energy currency of the cell, you'd be correct. So the whole purpose of us breathing is to be able to keep this process going, because we need the ATP to keep many of the reactions in our body going. Okay. Now, to maintain cellular respiration, or just CR, the respiratory system must work with the blank system to perform 3 key functions. And if you're trying to figure out the blank there, I'll give you a hint. What is it that actually transports these gases? If you said blood, and what transports blood? Which system? You said the cardiovascular system. We're on track. I could have seen if you came up with the nervous system too, because it's going to be regulated by the nervous system. But these two are essential to actually transport the oxygen and CO2. So what they have to perform is first what's called external respiration. This occurs in the lungs. So in external respiration, that is where O2 moves into blood from the air, and the air is external, hence why it's called external respiration, because we're exchanging with the external environment. And CO2 moves from blood into air. Again, being external. And this process uses the pulmonary, or what we could call the alveolar capillaries. Okay, so the second function, 2, we had external respiration. The second function is to transport blood containing gases between the lungs which is called which circuit? If you're heading to the lungs, you said pulmonary, great. And the body tissues. What circuit takes it to the body tissues? You said systemic? Fantastic. And this is achieved using arteries and veins, and of course the heart to actually pump it through. And then the third function that is necessary to be performed is internal respiration. And this occurs in the tissues, or the systemic capillaries. And here, O2 moves from blood into tissues, hence it being called internal, because the exchange is with your internal tissues. And CO2 moves from tissues, again internal, into blood. Thus, when we're talking about respiration, it actually includes 3 types of respiration. 1, external respiration. Which occurs where in the body? You said lungs, Fantastic. 2. Internal respiration, which occurs where? I said tissues. Very good. We're on track. And finally, the whole reason we do step 1 and 2 is for cellular respiration. And where specifically does this occur in your cells? What organelle? If you said the mitochondria of cells, you'd be correct. Okay? So, the bigger question is, how are gases moved and exchanged throughout our bodies? And it's really via a variety of mechanisms. It's not just hemoglobin carrying things. And here, a little bit of chemistry comes in handy. Okay. So we're going to look at the different gases and how they're moved. So let's start with oxygen. Approximately 2% of O2 is transported while dissolved in plasma. Whereas the vast majority, approximately 98% of O2 is transported while bound to hemoglobin in red blood cells. That little 2% is very vital though, because it's what's going to sort of pull our reactions one direction or the other. So that 98%, just to note, because we're going to be talking about this a lot, hemoglobin is abbreviated H, big H, little b, okay? And hemoglobin plus oxygen is abbreviated HB with a dot and then O2. And it's also called oxyhemoglobin. So hemoglobin becomes oxyhemoglobin if it binds to oxygen. Now, carbon dioxide has a slightly more complicated process for being transported. Approximately 7% is transported while dissolved in plasma, compared to 2% for oxygen. Another 25% is transported while bound to hemoglobin. And just to note, carbon dioxide plus hemoglobin is abbreviated HbCO2 and is called carboxyhemoglobin. But those of you who like math have already figured out, what about 68%? Approximately 68% of CO2 is actually transported as bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions have the formula HCO3 negative, and the bicarbonate ions are located within the red blood cell. So if that leaves you asking, what? No problem. What is this bicarbonate thing about? Well, within red blood cells, the following two-step reaction occurs. As you get increasing CO2 levels in your blood, it reacts with water and it is converted into what's called carbonic acid, H2CO3, which immediately dissociates into hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate ions, HCO3 negative. Okay? And in your red blood cell, we actually have an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that facilitates this reaction. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about how these reactions occur, but the important thing here to note, just for this section, is that if you have lots of CO2, you're going to actually end up producing your bicarbonate ion. But you're also going to produce a hydrogen ion, which could alter the pH of the cell or in the blood, so it needs to be dealt with to keep everything protected and safe. And just for here, this is called carbonic acid, and it's an intermediate step that is short-lived. It quickly changes in the forward reaction to the hydrogen ion and the bicarbonate ion, and if we're doing a backward reaction into CO2 plus H2O. So not only are we going to talk about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are moved excuse me, in the blood, we're also going to talk about what happens to these hydrogen ions. And the hydrogen ions produced by the carbon dioxide reaction then bind to our good old friend hemoglobin to form what is called reduced hemoglobin. Which is abbreviated with a big H for the hydrogen bonded to the HB. I'm not sure why they put that H out in front, unlike the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, but that is convention. thus buffering the blood from a drastic pH change. Which could then denature proteins. Okay, so that's how we transport gases. It's not quite as simple as just, oh, oxygen and carbon dioxide bind to hemoglobin. Some remains dissolved in the blood, some actually binds to hemoglobin, and a whole lot of carbon dioxide really isn't transported directly as carbon dioxide. So we're going to summarize gas exchange reactions in this table here. Just a quick review. If you're doing external respiration, which cardiovascular circuit are you going to use? Systemic or pulmonary? Because it's with the external environment where the air is, it is going to be pulmonary. Which then means internal respiration involves your systemic system or systemic circuit. In external respiration, the exchange of gases is occurring between the air and blood. And in internal, it's occurring between what and what? You said blood and tissue. You're correct. In the general movement of gas, the purpose for this, in the external respiration, we have O2 into blood from air and CO2 out of blood into the air. And then over here in internal respiration, we have O2 from blood into tissue. We have CO2 from tissue into blood. Now I understand these equations I'm about to show you can be challenging, so I don't want you to panic right away. We're going to look at them a couple different ways and see if we can master this. Okay, so the specific reactions, we're going to put this, I got rid of the line down the middle because these are what we call equilibrium reactions, meaning they can push either towards the internal respiration side or towards the external respiration side, depending on the conditions. So we can have CO2. If you have high CO2 levels, it's going to bind to hemoglobin and it's going to push towards forming carboxyhemoglobin, HbCO2. And where would we have high CO2 levels that we're trying to get rid of the CO2? You said in the tissues. You'd be correct, and this would represent, this equation would be for internal respiration. Okay, just remind yourself this is called carboxyhemoglobin. But if your CO2 levels drop, then this reaction is actually pushed back this way. This double arrow, this arrow is changed. It's an equilibrium arrow, and it's pushed back in the other direction for external respiration. And we need that free CO2 because that's what's going to diffuse out of the cell. Carboxyhemoglobin, the hemoglobin protein, has to stay inside the cell and it can't diffuse out. So it must first release the CO2 and then the CO2 can leave the cell. Okay. In contrast, if you have hemoglobin bound to oxygen, this is oxyhemoglobin, and you go to a situation where you have lots of oxyhemoglobin but very little free oxygen, it's going to pull the reaction such that oxygen is going to separate from the hemoglobin and become free, and when it's free, then it can diffuse, such as it does in the tissues of internal respiration. In contrast, if you're in a situation where O2 is really high, it's going to bind to hemoglobin and push the reaction to form oxyhemoglobin, as it does during external respiration. We also talked about the situation where we have high CO2 binding to water, forming what's called carbonic acid, H2CO3, which readily breaks down into hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate ion. If we're in a situation where our CO2 levels drop, we're actually going to go back in the opposite direction. So we have high CO2 levels in the internal situation, so it pushes it this way. And we have low CO2 levels in the external situation, pulling it the other way. Sorry, my pen died there. So going back in the other direction, being the external respiration. And just a quick reminder, this is carbonic acid. This is called your bicarbonate ion. And the enzyme that assists this, and interestingly, it works in both directions, is carbonic acid. Carbonic anhydrase. So assisting both in the external or internal direction, we have carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so that's one way to summarize the internal and external reactions that are occurring for gas exchange in the body. Another way to look at it is to actually look a bit more at a picture in paragraph format. Okay. Before we do that, we're just going to take a little note about chemical equations and equilibrium for those of you who don't have chemistry. If you understand equilibrium quite well, you probably could skip writing down these notes. You might want to listen to them, but you don't necessarily have to write them down. So, the best way to think about this in terms of what's going on here is that nature, let's go back to black. Nature likes balance, such that if you alter conditions, on one side of an equation or system, the system or equation, so the equation or system tends to shift. to maintain balance, or what we call equilibrium. I mean, this isn't a new concept to us in biology, because it's just as our bodies shift to maintain homeostasis. We make adjustments because we want to keep the balance. And chemical reactions follow this natural law. Okay? So, to understand, or another way of representing this, understanding equilibrium reactions, I'll give you just a very simple example. So let's say you had a situation where A plus B could form a compound AB. And the equilibrium arrow's in the middle, meaning that AB can also shift back to form A plus B. In this situation, you can essentially push the reaction to the right to make more AB or get more AB if you increase concentration of A and or of B, depending on if there's a limiting factor there. You can likewise pull the reaction to left if you decrease concentration of A or B. As well, you can push reaction to the left if you increase concentration of AB, the compound, or you can pull reaction to the right if you decrease concentration of A or B. So you can push and pull a reaction, get things to go in a certain direction by altering the concentration of what's on each side of the arrow. Okay? This is what's happening in our body. So if we look at something as simple as hemoglobin, Hb plus oxygen can form oxyhemoglobin. If we increase our concentration of oxygen, we will actually push it to form oxyhemoglobin. If we decrease our concentration of oxygen, we will pull it to actually separate the hemoglobin and oxygen into hemoglobin plus O2. Okay? So that's important in how our systems work. So we're going to finally summarize this in a diagram showing the gas exchange in our body with a little paragraph. And we're going to look here at the lungs versus systemic. So this is going to be pulmonary circuit versus systemic circuit. And if we're in the pulmonary, it's going to be external. And if we're in the systemic, internal. So let's talk about external respiration. Okay. What first happens is you have high O2 following normal diffusion principles. So high O2 from air diffuses into low O2 blood, binds to hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. In contrast, high CO2 from blood plasma, remember, about 7% was diffused in the actual plasma. So that high CO2 from blood plasma diffuses into low CO2 air. But what this does is it decreases your level of CO2 actually in the blood plasma, and this pulls the bicarbonate reaction and carboxyhemoglobin reaction such that HCO3 minus combines with the excess hydrogen ions to form H2CO3 carbonic acid, which immediately breaks down into H2O plus CO2, free carbon dioxide in the blood, which will then diffuse out. And HB CO2 will also dissociate into HB plus CO2. And again, the high CO2 in the blood will diffuse out into the low CO2 air. So that's external respiration. Okay. And in internal respiration, it's basically the reverse. As high O2 from blood, and remember, some of it's diffused in the plasma, so it's going to right away diffuse out into low O2 tissues. This will drop your O2 levels in the plasma, and basically this pulls the oxyhemoglobin reaction such that the bound hemoglobin will release and become hemoglobin plus O2, and that free O2 is then free to dissolve into the tissues. So diffuse, not dissolve, diffuses into tissues. because it's higher than what's found in the tissues. Okay? At the same time, high CO2 from tissues diffuses into the blood, where it reacts with H2O and hemoglobin such that we get high CO2 joining the blood, reacting with water, becoming carbonic acid, and then immediately breaking down into hydrogen ions plus bicarbonate ions. Now remember, this process requires an enzyme within the red blood cell called carbonic anhydrase. And CO2 reacts with the hemoglobin to form carboxyhemoglobin. Plus, this little hydrogen here needs to be taken care of, so we're not changing the pH in our blood and denaturing our enzymes. So to do that, luckily, as you increase H+, it binds to hemoglobin as well to form HB, which is reduced hemoglobin. And up here is carboxyhemoglobin. Okay, so that summarizes how the reactions occur, internal and external. One thing I didn't mention up here is up here the hydrogen ion concentration is being lowered because it's reacting with the bicarbonate ion, and because that lowers, it pulls HB to release and become HB plus H+. Okay, so that's the summary of the chemical reactions that are occurring for us to breathe. Probably a little more complicated than you anticipated. Okay, and the truth of the matter is we've still simplified it somewhat. Good thing to know, oxygen gets to our tissues and to our brain and works so that we can actually learn about stuff like this. If you have any questions, please come see me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class.